He was the last one still buckled in when the call came through. It hit his earpiece with a crackle of static, the voice of command clear and sharp. Abort mission. Intel corrupted. Asset location uncertain. Extraction window compromised. The pilot's tone shifted immediately. The bird banked hard left, away from the drop zone. The others nodded, eyes already on the secondary route, but he didn't move. He was staring at the screen clipped to his vest. One last frame from the drone feed, barely a blur of motion, but it was enough. He saw what the others didn't, a flicker of truth buried in deception. While the rest of the team prepared to reroute, he unbuckled, stood and grabbed the rope. There was no command to proceed, no new green light, just instinct, forged in repetition and sharpened by years in the field. He stepped into the wind and dropped. The others would argue later that he'd misunderstood the order, that he'd misread the situation, that he'd risked everything on a gut feeling. But that wasn't true. He knew exactly what he was doing. The mission wasn't dead, the danger wasn't new, and if the target was still breathing inside that compound, someone had to act. Someone had to go in. By the time the bird circled back to base, he was already on the ground, already moving through a jagged ravine that cut behind the outer wall. He had no backup, no overwatch, just the rifle on his back, 2 mags, a combat knife, and a reason. He moved through shadow like smoke, avoiding the patrols, climbing over rusted fencing, slipping past sensor lights that buzzed faintly in the dust. Inside the compound, he could feel it, the tension, the staging, the bait. It was a trap, yes, but not for him. Not anymore. He had become something else now, something stripped of caution, of protocol, of hesitation. What happened next couldn't be mapped. It couldn't be debriefed on paper. There were no helmet cams, no drone feeds, no confirmation reports. There was just him, a flicker of movement behind a locked door, a man tied to a chair with blood on his mouth, and the noise that followed when one determined operator refused to leave a man behind. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he went anyway. The first indication that something was off came in the form of a data packet buried inside an encrypted message intercepted by signals intelligence outside Kandahar. At first glance, it was routine. A transmission flagged as chatter between mid-tier operatives, little more than logistical coordination. Fuel movement, safehouse confirmations, low-level routing. But one of the junior analysts spotted an anomaly in the packet header. An old identifier, a ghost, a reference string not seen since an extraction op gone wrong months earlier. A missing American, a civilian contractor with top-level access, presumed dead. The files were buried, the case closed quietly, the family given a folded flag and no body. But here it was, a heartbeat in the noise, faint, possibly spoofed but impossible to ignore. Command pulled it instantly and rerouted it for decryption priority. The entire mission brief built itself in under 6 hours. By morning, a potential location had been identified, a walled compound nestled inside a narrow gorge northeast of the Arghandab River. The satellite imagery was limited due to heavy cloud cover, but thermal contrast confirmed foot traffic in and out of the complex, unusual for a location with no visible power source and no confirmed vehicle route. The buildings looked makeshift at best. No external comms antennae, no solar panels, no clear entry road. That alone was enough to raise questions. But it was the movement patterns that drew attention. No civilian indicators, no grazing livestock, no children. Just clustered, timed footfalls, pacing, rotating, security protocol. Someone was guarding something. Initial assessment flagged it as a forward operating safehouse, a mid-level operations center for coordinating regional activity, maybe weapons transfers, maybe intel. But then came a second confirmation, this time from human intelligence. A source embedded in the border province reported seeing a Western male transferred into the area under heavy guard. No name, no photos. Just an age range, physical description, and detail that stuck with the planning team like a splinter. The captive wore American boots, new ones, standard issue. That was enough. The field team was spun up within the hour. 5 men, all Tier 1, tasked with direct action capture or rescue under limited exposure parameters. No air cover, no prolonged contact. Get in, confirm, extract. The window was tight. Cloud cover would mask their approach, but the terrain around the compound offered little flexibility once the boots were on the ground. The drop point had to be precise. Insertion would happen via low silhouette helicopter pass. Fast rope. Approach on foot, identify the target. Get out before the ground force could mobilize. But the closer they got to launch, the worse the data became. By the time the bird was fully loaded and in pre-check, new intel suggested increased insurgent movement just outside the valley. A convoy of fighters spotted moving into the region, possibly reinforcing the area in anticipation of an American incursion. The drone feeds went glitchy, heat signatures became erratic, and then, just 25 minutes before liftoff, a black flag notice was issued. High risk of compromise. Orders from above changed. Command didn't like the volatility. The mission wasn't canceled completely, just delayed. Hold until further notice. Abort approach. Await reassessment at 0400. Inside the aircraft, the team was already seated, gear secured, weapons locked in. They'd trained for rapid response 100 times before. Most operations involved this kind of uncertainty, but something about this one didn't sit right. The data felt thin, the risk disproportionate. And still, the man sitting near the door didn't flinch when the pilot repeated the updated command. He sat forward, checking his kit again, checked his mags, his knife, his radio. He knew something the others didn't. Maybe not in specifics, but in instinct. He'd seen operations scrubbed before, seen the hesitation up top, the risk assessments, the doctrine of caution that sometimes left real assets behind because the math didn't justify the risk. But he wasn't built for math. He was built for movement, for clarity, for action when others paused, and something deep in his gut told him that if they didn't act now, it would be too late. Whoever was in that compound wouldn't be there tomorrow, maybe not even an hour from now. They would vanish into the network, repurposed, relocated, silenced. The signal had only come through once, and someone had to respond. He looked at the tablet mounted on the interior wall, flicked through the final set of terrain captures, marked a path through the back wall of the compound, an irrigation route buried beneath collapsed stone. If it hadn't been for the last thermal pass, no one would have seen it. A single signature, still, cold, human, but alone, separate from the others, possibly the hostage, possibly bait. It didn't matter. He clipped his rope to the carabiner on his harness and stood. The others didn't notice until the red light went solid. The aircraft began to tilt away from the approach vector, preparing to divert. He moved anyway. Grip firm, feet balanced, eyes locked. The door opened, wind howled in. Command repeated the order to abort. But he had already decided. Because to him, a signal wasn't just data, it was a voice. And voices left behind don't always get a second chance. He dropped the last 10 feet of the rope without waiting for confirmation. His boots hit the sand with a heavy thud, and he was already moving before the rotors pulled the bird back into the cloud cover. The wind from the exfil still howled through the canyon, masking his steps as he darted between the shadows of scattered rock and fractured scrub brush. The terrain was sharper than it had looked in the satellite images, more uneven, more hostile. The valley narrowed with ridgelines that leaned in like closing hands. It wasn't made for movement, especially not for someone moving alone, but he didn't hesitate. The compound lay roughly a half-kilometer from his position, tucked into the far side of the wadi. From this distance, he could see the outer perimeter walls, tall but worn, a haphazard mix of mud brick and scavenged steel plating. There were gaps, points of failure, but also cameras. Old, analog, flickering in and out. They weren't part of any advanced network, but they were live. And someone was watching. He moved low, circling the edge of the cliff face, scanning for sentries. At first, he didn't see any, which was strange. Then he spotted them. 2 men on the northeast wall, sitting under a rusted awning, rifles slung loose, helmets off. They weren't disciplined, weren't alert, but they were armed. A third man moved between the main building and the watchtower, his gait relaxed. No sense of urgency, no sense of threat. That was his first confirmation. They weren't expecting anything tonight. Whatever intel had prompted command to abort hadn't reached the people inside. That was his advantage. He kept his rifle up, eyes on optics, counting every footfall and measuring every blind spot between patrol patterns. Time was no longer just about minutes. It was about footsteps, heartbeats, shadows moving across concrete. He reached the far wall after 15 minutes of crawling through rock and sand. The irrigation trench he had seen on satellite was there, partially collapsed, but still hollowed out beneath the lowest portion of the perimeter. A narrow stone culvert, probably a forgotten utility access, wide enough for one man to squeeze through. He pulled a breaching mirror from his side pouch and angled it inside. No tripwires, no lights, just darkness and silence. He moved forward inch by inch, sliding on his stomach, hands pulling at the earth, his body compressed into the dirt. It took nearly 10 minutes to move 15 meters through the culvert. He emerged beneath a rusted sheet of fencing, bent and buried in debris. He pushed it up slowly, just enough to pass under. On the other side, the compound's inner yard opened in front of him. Silent, cracked earth, tire tracks from old pickups, and a few stacks of crates under a camouflage tarp. He was inside. No alarms, no dogs, no tripwires. But it was too quiet. Not in the empty way, but in the staged way. A stillness that didn't come from sleep, but from control. Someone had planned this layout. The silence wasn't neglect, it was design. He kept his rifle tucked tight and moved behind a storage shed. From here, he had a line of sight on the main structure. 3 windows visible, all sealed. 1 metal door, slightly ajar, with a faint light leaking from the frame. The corridor beyond flickered with what looked like fluorescent strips. There were voices now, barely audible, muffled through concrete and distance. He crept closer, bootfalls absorbed by sand and cloth. The voices weren't speaking English. Short, clipped phrases in Pashto. Orders, routine. He held still, waited until one of them moved across the window, then counted. 3. Maybe 4 inside. The structure itself was older than expected. Concrete with wooden beams. Bullet marks pocked the outer walls, old and weathered. One corner sagged, reinforced with sandbags. He moved to the far side and found a vent system, crude, barely functional. He pulled a fiber camera from his harness and fed it through. Inside was a hallway. 1 flickering bulb. 2 doors on the left, 1 closed, 1 open. Through the open door, he saw a desk. Papers. A monitor. And in the corner of the room, a body tied to a chair. His heart rate slowed. He blinked once. Hard. Focused. It was the contractor. Emaciated, bruised, duct tape across the mouth, but breathing. Alive. Still upright. And completely alone in the room. He retreated from the vent, surveyed the entry points again. 1 main entrance. Possibly a side exit toward the back courtyard. He chose the direct route. He pulled a breaching charge from his back plate. Small, silent. Enough to force the door open without collapsing the frame. He placed it low. Stepped back. Triggered with a soft squeeze. The door popped inward with a sharp hiss. He was through before the dust settled. The 2 men in the hallway never had time to raise their weapons. 2 rounds. 2 impacts. Both down. He pivoted left, cleared the open room. Empty. Crossed to the next doorway, locked. He kicked low. The door gave way. Inside, the contractor flinched at the sound, but didn't move beyond that. The SEAL moved to him immediately, scanning, checking. No visible fractures, severe dehydration, possible concussion, but alive. He cut the restraints quickly, wrapped the man's arm over his shoulder, and hoisted him upright. The contractor groaned softly, but his legs moved. They wouldn't run, but they could move. That was all he needed. He scanned again. No new threats. But voices were rising outside. Footsteps. The first breach was done. Now came the escape. He shifted the contractor's weight onto his shoulder and took a moment to steady himself. The man was conscious, but barely. His legs weak, body limp, and breathing shallow. He was thinner than the last known photos, at least 20 pounds lighter, and his skin was the pale tone of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Blood had dried along his hairline and jaw, and bruises marked his neck and collarbone. The duct tape had left raw skin behind, but the eyes were clear enough to register recognition, if not understanding. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't resist. Whether he knew who was helping him or not, didn't matter. The SEAL adjusted his grip and moved out into the hallway, rifle raised with one hand, the other securing the hostage upright against his side. The compound was awake now. Boots thudded against the concrete outside, and harsh voices barked orders in panicked overlapping bursts. The element of surprise was gone, but that didn't mean the fight had to be theirs. He moved fast, retracing his path back toward the point of breach. The first 2 bodies in the hall remained where they'd dropped, weapons untouched. The SEAL didn't stop to loot them. He had what he needed. He passed through the shadowed corridor and pushed out into the yard. The night air hit his face like a wave, hot, dry, and tinged with the smell of burning fuel. Somewhere to the east, a generator had kicked on, humming low and steady. Floodlights flickered to life along the southern wall, sweeping arcs of white light over the ground, chasing shadows from one corner to the next. He dipped immediately behind the nearest stack of crates, crouching to shield both himself and the contractor. Voices drew closer. Multiple sets of footsteps now, at least 5, maybe more. One pair of boots stopped just on the other side of the crates. The SEAL held his breath, finger on the trigger, then moved. He stood fast, took one clean shot at close range, and pivoted right. The body collapsed without sound. The others began shouting. One fired a burst into the dark, hitting nothing. Another ran. He fired again. 2 down, still moving, still dragging the hostage with him, now across the open stretch of yard. He needed to get back to the culvert, the same narrow path through which he had entered. It was the only way out without walking straight into a wall of gunfire. The gate to the south was already opening, voices beyond it rising in pitch and confusion. They hadn't seen him yet, not clearly. That would change in seconds. He reached the edge of the debris pile near the trench and dropped to one knee, letting the hostage slide gently into the low space beside the broken fencing. He pressed his shoulder into the metal sheet, trying to create a gap wide enough for both of them. A spotlight swept overhead, hesitated, and then snapped back. It had found them. The shouting turned urgent. Gunfire cracked from the far end of the yard. He didn't wait. He shoved the contractor forward into the trench, rolled in behind him, and pulled the fencing down over their backs. Bullets tore through the sheet metal, pinging against the rock and dirt, but the angle kept them protected. He pushed forward, dragging the man by his vest, inch by inch through the narrow passage. Dirt filled his mouth. The contractor coughed and gasped, nearly too weak to crawl, but he moved when prompted, feet scraping behind him. They cleared the trench in under a minute, emerging just beyond the wall's edge. The SEAL rose, pulled the man upright again, and began the next stretch of the walk, this one across open terrain, 100 meters to the ravine. Behind them, alarms were being raised. A horn blared. More gunfire. A truck engine revved to life, tires screeching. The compound was mobilizing, and they were moving slow. He slung his rifle back and shifted to a fireman's carry, lifting the hostage over his shoulders despite the screaming protests from his own wounded leg. Every step sent a shockwave up his spine, but he kept going. The desert floor was uneven and scattered with loose shale. He stumbled once, regained balance, kept moving. They reached the ridge just as the first truck crested the far side of the yard. He dropped into the ravine without ceremony, rolling with the hostage to minimize impact. The fall reopened one of his own cuts, but he didn't stop to check it. He crawled toward a cluster of boulders and pulled the hostage behind cover. The enemy hadn't yet figured out which direction he'd gone. Their headlights scanned outward, searching. The SEAL pulled a smoke grenade from his vest, cracked it, and let it roll down the slope opposite their direction to throw them off. The thick white plume billowed quickly, curling into the wind and obscuring the east. The vehicle took the bait, veering off in the wrong direction. He used the moment to move again, this time sticking to the low edge of the gorge, working his way east toward the fallback site. The extraction bird wasn't scheduled. There was no window. No call had been made. But he knew if he got the hostage far enough into open terrain, if he reached a line-of-sight position with enough high ground to signal, he could force a pickup. He just had to stay ahead of the response wave. For the next hour, he alternated between dragging and carrying. The terrain fought him every step. Rocks, thorns, narrow ledges that cut open his palms. He lost sensation in his arms halfway through. The contractor drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring once, then falling silent. The SEAL didn't stop to check vitals. He didn't need to. The man was still warm, still breathing. As the first light crept into the sky behind them, he finally saw what he was looking for. A flat shelf on the western bluff, just wide enough to mark an LZ. He climbed the final slope on bleeding knees, planted the hostage behind a stone ledge, and reached into his vest for the emergency strobe. The light blinked 3 times, then paused, blinked again. He waited. Blinked a 3rd time. He set it on the ground beside the contractor and raised his rifle toward the horizon, scanning for movement. He was still alone, but not for long. He lay prone behind a flat slab of stone, eyes scanning the horizon through the dim bluish pre-dawn light that blanketed the valley like a cold breath. The hostage lay just behind him, limp and barely responsive, tucked between 2 slabs of rock that formed a crude shelter. The emergency strobe pulsed steadily on the ground beside them, its light barely visible from a distance, but unmistakable from above. The signal was active, the location marked. Now came the hard part. Waiting long enough for the bird to arrive without being overrun by the fighters scrambling below. The compound had erupted after his escape, its alarm drawing in nearby militia groups, local affiliates, opportunists. Radios crackled with noise. Gunshots rang out in short, aimless bursts, more warning than precision. But the pursuit had begun. They were fanning out in a circular pattern, searching for tracks, broken brush, disturbed dirt, anything that led them toward the American ghost who had breached their safe house and vanished into the hills with a captive they'd never planned to give up. He could hear them before he could see them. Voices rising in the distance, trucks backfiring as they bounced over uneven ridges, shouting layered in frustration and adrenaline. It wouldn't take long for them to start narrowing in on his position. He looked down at the ground below and saw the mistakes he'd made. The boot prints, the drag lines, small but visible trails left in the softest sand between rocks. They told a story. A slow-moving man carrying another. An injured escapee with purpose. And with every second that passed, the enemy was reading it more clearly. He reached for his rifle and checked the chamber again. It was still warm from earlier contact, the scent of cordite clinging to the steel. He adjusted his angle, slowing his breath, and sighted the trail just to the east of the plateau. That's where they'd come from first. Easiest access, least elevation. He counted 3 heads, then 5. All moving low, weapons up. Their silhouettes broke against the skyline as they crept from boulder to tree to ridge. Not trained soldiers, at least not by Western standards, but dangerous all the same. Determined, emboldened by numbers. He waited until the lead man crossed into the shadow of a split boulder and then fired once. The round punched through the chest, center mass, dropping the target instantly. The others froze for half a breath, then began shouting, scattering. He took the next shot half a second later, center of the chest again. The remaining 3 returned fire, spraying wildly in his direction, but he was already moving. He rolled to a secondary position, 20 meters south, using a small gully to reposition. The ground vibrated with the echo of the gunfire. Dust kicked up around him, peppering his neck and face with tiny shards of grit and heat. He crawled up a new incline and peeked over the ledge. The fighters were regrouping, one calling out coordinates into a handheld radio. That was the worst sign. They weren't just hunting. They were coordinating. Reinforcements would come next, and they'd bring heavier firepower. He had minutes, maybe less. He fired again, clipped one of the men in the leg, watched him spin sideways into a tumble. The others dropped out of view. He turned and ran back to the hostage, dropped to one knee and checked for movement. Still breathing, still unconscious. The man's face twitched slightly in pain, but no sound escaped his lips. He wrapped the strobe light into a rag and tied it to the highest visible point he could find. A broken wooden stake jammed into a rocky crevice. The signal still blinked, steady and quiet, marking their position like a flare that only a pilot's HUD could interpret. Movement to the west caught his attention. More shapes. Closer this time. At least 7. Closing fast, no longer cautious. One fired a long burst across the plateau, the rounds impacting too far south to threaten them, but getting closer. Another fired a grenade launcher, the round arcing high and landing somewhere below with a muted thud and a flash of flame. They were testing now, estimating range, closing the net. He grabbed the contractor again, slung him into a fireman's carry despite the searing pain that shot through his shoulder and spine, and moved. Not away from the signal, but down slope, toward a secondary position 30 meters below. Harder to hit from the ridge, better cover, lower profile. His boots skidded across rock. Twice he nearly lost his footing, but he kept his balance. Every stumble was a potential break, every sound a betrayal. He reached the secondary ledge and set the contractor down again. The man groaned softly, stirred, tried to speak but couldn't form words. The SEAL pressed a water tube to his lips, gave him 3 small sips, then adjusted his vest to protect against shrapnel. The fighting was about to crest the ridgeline. The enemy was closing in from 2 sides now. They had learned. One flank suppressed while the other advanced. Crude tactics, but effective in open terrain. He waited until the first head broke over the lip, then fired again. Short, controlled bursts. The fighter fell backward, dragging another down with him. But that didn't stop the others. They surged. Bullets cracked over the rock, one grazing the stone near his face, another hitting his pack and punching through a side pouch. He returned fire in measured pairs, then ducked low and rolled again, relocating to a third firing point further downhill. The contractor lay silent behind the rocks, eyes closed again, chest still rising and falling. Every round the SEAL fired bought them seconds. Just enough time for hope to catch up with reality. Then, in the distance, the The sound changed. Not gunfire, not shouting. A low, rhythmic thump. A pattern every operator knew without needing confirmation. Rotor blades. He looked up. Just above the far ridge, dark against the brightening sky, a Black Hawk dipped low and fast. It banked hard, approaching from the blind side, avoiding the heaviest fire zones. He stood up, pulled a flare from his vest, cracked it, and waved it in wide arcs. The chopper saw him immediately. The bird dropped its nose, pushed forward, side doors already open. Enemy fire intensified. One round punched into the rocks near his hip. Another zipped past his shoulder. He dropped the flare, lifted the contractor again, and sprinted the final stretch as the chopper descended. The ramp hit the ground hard, and crewmen reached for him. He handed off the hostage, turned, and fired 3 final rounds back into the trees. Then he climbed aboard. The bird lifted, rotors screaming, skimming just above the ravine floor, then banking up and out. Below them, the fighters scattered, firing uselessly into the air. He collapsed inside, chest heaving, hands trembling from fatigue. But he didn't look back. The Black Hawk pulled hard into the sky, banking low across the canyon as its rotors shredded the early morning haze. The interior was dim, red-lit, noisy with comms chatter and the hum of mechanical tension that filled every inch of the airframe. The SEAL sat slumped against the bulkhead, his chest rising in uneven bursts, sweat pouring down his back despite the cold seeping through his fatigues. His hands, still locked around the grip of his rifle, slowly loosened, but never dropped. He was alert in the way only someone who had just crawled out of the jaws of death could be. Tense, watchful, and scanning. Across from him, the contractor lay stretched out on a fold-down stretcher, IV taped to his forearm, face half covered in oxygen tubing. The flight medic knelt beside him, methodically checking vitals, scanning for signs of internal bleeding, and logging everything on a battered tablet that barely worked in the turbulence. The contractor didn't speak. He barely moved. But the pulse was steady, shallow but present, and the faint rise and fall of his chest offered the only reassurance anyone needed. He was alive, which was more than anyone had expected when the mission was scrubbed. The SEAL's world shrank down to sensations now. Sharp edges of the steel plating beneath him, the weight of the vest biting into his shoulders, the dull throb of every muscle and tendon in his legs. His mouth was dry, his lips cracked, and blood still crusted along his right arm from a cut he hadn't noticed during the fight. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind the skeletal aches of dehydration and strain. He blinked slowly, once, then again, fixing his gaze out the small rectangular window to his left. Below them, the land passed like a dream, rolling hills, jagged ravines, endless swaths of dust-blown emptiness dotted with scattered compounds and the occasional burnt-out husk of a transport truck long since abandoned. It was a landscape that looked unchanged by time or war, a place indifferent to suffering or valor. In those moments, the scale of it all settled in. The absurdity of one man's choice to go alone into the fire, to defy protocol, to bend the rules because something in his gut refused to let the mission die quietly. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset feed, informing the team that they were approaching the outer perimeter of the forward operating base. ETA 12 minutes. Friendly airspace. The worst of the threat was behind them now, but everyone on board knew better than to relax. Complacency killed, even in flight. Especially then. The crew chief moved through the bay, checking harnesses, ensuring gear was secure, nodding once at the SEAL but saying nothing. There wasn't anything to say. Everything had already been done. The SEAL finally lowered his rifle, resting it between his knees, and rolled his shoulders back with a grimace. The pain was everywhere now. Not sharp, but deep. Old bruises flaring back to life, the pull of strained tendons, the low pulse of swelling in his ankle where he'd slipped on the descent slope. He looked down at the contractor again, a man who had been marked dead, buried in classified reports, his loss calculated as an acceptable operational risk. But here he was, strapped to a stretcher, unconscious and battered, but breathing. The value of that weighed heavier than any metal. It was the silent reason that justified the choice to disobey. The helicopter began to slow. The pitch of the blades changed as the craft descended. Through the window, lights appeared, small at first, then clearer. The perimeter of the base came into view, a series of concrete barriers, antenna towers, and sandbagged positions manned by soldiers who were only just learning of the mission's resurrection. When the bird touched down, it did so hard. Dust exploded outward, and the rear ramp dropped before the wheels even stopped turning. Medical personnel were already in place, rushing forward as the medics began unloading the contractor. The SEAL stood slowly, moving like a man whose joints had turned to rust, and followed them out into the pale dawn. The air was thick with rotors and radio calls, but around him the world moved in slow motion. Every face he passed seemed to wear a look of restrained disbelief, nodding recognition, quiet awe, or unspoken confusion. There were no cheers, no clapping on the back, just a shared understanding that something impossible had happened. The contractor disappeared into the triage tent, flanked by medical staff. The SEAL stood outside for a moment longer, unmoving, eyes locked on the canvas that swallowed the only living proof of his mission. Then someone approached. A man in a command uniform, tablet in hand, expression unreadable. Words were exchanged, most of them bureaucratic. Debrief times, medical checks, temporary quarters. The SEAL nodded once, barely. He handed off his rifle, unclipped the vest, and dropped it on a nearby bench. It hit the surface with a metallic thud, landing like a punctuation mark to a chapter no one else had read. His shirt beneath was soaked through, torn at the shoulder, blood and dirt forming abstract patterns across his chest and arms. He sat down heavily, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, breathing steady now, but shallow. Around him, the base woke up. Generators whirred, helicopters cycled, troops moved between bunkers and shelters, already deep in the rhythm of the next operation. But for him, the world was quiet. The exfil wasn't victory, it was pause. A breath drawn before the weight of what had happened would settle fully. A reckoning of choices made when no one else dared move. He hadn't gone in for glory. He hadn't expected rescue. He'd done it because someone had to. Because orders end where conviction begins. And now, he was home. At least for now. The room was cold, overlit, and empty, except for a folding table, 4 metal chairs, and a voice recorder sitting in the center like a silent witness. The SEAL sat alone, elbows resting on the table, hands still scarred and swollen. The faint traces of dried blood beneath his nails, a reminder of everything that had happened in the hours before. The debrief had been scheduled for first light, barely a few hours after the exfil bird touched down, but time felt irrelevant now. He hadn't slept, hadn't asked for food, hadn't made a single request. He had walked off the ramp, handed off the hostage, stripped out of his gear, and waited. Not because he was unsure of what came next, but because he had lived enough missions to know how this one would be handled. Quietly, carefully, dissected not by the people who had bled on the ground, but by those who read it from a screen. The door opened with a soft metallic click, and 3 men entered. Civilian suits, military bearing, analysts. One carried a folder thick with printed reports and drone stills. Another had a tablet under one arm and a notepad under the other. The last wore no identification at all. Just a plain jacket and eyes that hadn't blinked once since they entered. They took their seats without introduction. One of them turned on the recorder. The static cleared. The light blinked red. The questions began. He told the story in order. Not out of obligation, but out of necessity. Every movement, every decision, every shot fired, every detour taken. He spoke without emotion, not because he didn't feel it, but because there was no place for sentiment here. The facts mattered. The timeline mattered. The sequence of events had to be surgically precise. When he explained the breach, the culvert, the crawl through the trench, the exact placement of the entry charge, they asked no questions. When he described the hostage's condition, the fire in the hallway, the pursuit through the ravine, the exfil contact, then they began to take notes. Numbers were exchanged, confirmed kills estimated, distance traveled from breach to extraction point calculated. They cross-referenced satellite logs, matched the time codes. But even with all the verification, one fact remained unspoken yet obvious. The mission had been officially aborted. The extraction never should have happened. The signal never should have gone out. And yet, there he sat. They asked him why he went in anyway. He didn't answer at first, not because he didn't have a reason, but because they wouldn't understand it in the way he did. The mission wasn't a line item to him. It wasn't binary. Didn't end at a red light or a denied protocol. It was a thread, and once pulled, it couldn't be ignored. When he finally did speak, it was short, because there was still someone alive inside, because the trail was still warm, because waiting meant letting them win. The men exchanged glances, then moved on. There were questions about equipment, about communications. Why didn't he check in after the breach? Why didn't he request backup? Why didn't he extract alone after the firefight and mark the site for a larger team? They used words like deviation and unsanctioned. The SEAL didn't respond. He sat there, letting the weight of their language slide off his shoulders like water on worn stone. Eventually, the questions ended. The recording stopped. The lights dimmed. The men stood and walked out without final words. The SEAL remained for a while, eyes fixed on the wall, the silence now thicker than the interrogation. He didn't need approval. He didn't want vindication. The mission was over, and the man they thought was dead was alive. That was enough. In the days that followed, the reports circulated through secure channels, redacted for most, preserved in full for a select few. The file was classified under a new heading, not a recovery, not a clean operation. It was labeled with a phrase seldom used, and even more rarely earned: operator discretion. Internally, it became a training case, one used to examine judgment under extreme isolation, decision-making beyond the scope of active orders. Outside of those closed walls, nothing was said. There were no press releases, no medals, no names read aloud. Back in the compound's data logs, analysts found encrypted files left behind during the breach. One of them contained a kill list with code names. The contractor's was at the top. Below it, another name had been added manually, scribbled in a different hand: the SEAL's call sign. Somehow they had known he would come. Somehow they had expected him. But that expectation hadn't changed the outcome. The contractor recovered slowly. He remained under medical observation for several weeks before being transferred to a facility stateside. His memory returned in fragments. Small flashes of the rescue, the firefight, the voice that told him to hold on. He gave his own account to a separate team. It aligned perfectly with the SEAL's. When the operation was reviewed in total, a single line stood out in the final after-action document. A note written not by the analysts or the officers, but someone who had read the raw data, watched the unedited drone feed, and understood what happened. It simply read, "He went in alone, but didn't leave that way." No formal commendation followed. No official credit was assigned. But among the community, the ones who knew, the story traveled faster than the redacted file. It passed from fire bases to training rooms, to whisper briefings between younger operators and seasoned ghosts. They spoke of the mission not with reverence, but with gravity, because it proved something they all believed but rarely saw confirmed. Sometimes, the right call isn't the one you're given. Sometimes, it's the one you decide to carry on your own.